perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello, folks. I'm Harry Greenberger, back to bring you an interesting program. And as you heard in the introduction, our secular humanists, part of our philosophy is that we should live full, rewarding lives and do those things that contribute to good lives, since this is the only one we're going to have. Well, in keeping with that concept, there was an article in the Times-Picayune about a new project manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and very interesting article about the refuges in our area. And the new project manager said, for her and the company, that means reaching out to a diverse public seeking different things from their refuges. Public engagement is really important, she said. We have to let people know who we are and what we do, and that is why my guest today is David Stoughton, who is a supervisory park ranger with that group. And David, I'm going to let you just tell us about the refuges, and I may interrupt occasionally.
Well, please do. Yeah, so thank you, Harry, for the opportunity to come and speak on behalf of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and all of our refuges here in Southeast Louisiana. So I think you touched on a couple of major issues out of that quote. Is one of the biggest things that we struggle with and that we are trying to do in terms of our refuges here is engage the public in meaningful ways and make connections so that people have a better understanding of the importance of the research and the value of the 8 refuges in Southeast Louisiana. And my name's David. I'm from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm the Visitor Services Manager.
And you said there are 8 of them in our area.
Right, okay. Yeah. So there are 8 refuges that comprise 160,000 acres of coastal wetlands. Each one of them are unique in their mission, but mostly they're set aside for migratory bird habitat. In New Orleans, we have one of the largest urban refuges. That urban is the term to describe a geographical term, its proximity to the city center. And so 26,000 acres, it's the largest plot of land in New Orleans, is a national wildlife refuge.
Does it have a name?
It does. It's Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge. It was set aside in the 1980s to preserve habitat for migratory waterfowl. So it's right at the end of the Mississippi Flyway. About half the birds in North America fly this route annually on their migration, and one of their last stops is at Bayou Sauvage.
And how accessible is that from downtown New Orleans?
Yeah, so from where we are right now on Jeff Davis Parkway, it's about 15, maybe 20 minutes. It is off a Chef Highway. Okay. There are 2 access points there that have boardwalks and little nature trails. It's a great place for wildlife observation, photography, and some of the other kind of ways that we want the public to interact with the refuges in a responsible way.
Okay.
So our public outreach is geared towards 6 major areas, and that's a couple that I mentioned, which is photography and wildlife observation. But we also engage people through education programming, mostly youth kids. This last year, we did over 200 programs in total at all 8 of our refuges, and reached over 2,000 youth and teachers through those programs. So photography, wildlife observation, interpretation, environmental education, hunting, and fishing. Those are all things that we kind of get people engaged in a responsible way.
Now, when you have groups like the children groups, there will be someone along to narrate and discuss. Are you one of those people?
Yeah, so I'm a park ranger, and that's a pretty broad term. So I work in visitor services, and that covers all the areas that I mentioned, including volunteerism. We do a huge amount of volunteer work. But myself or one of my colleagues will go to the schools, or the schools will come to us, and we do kind of facilitated environmental education programming.
I see. Now, a tour, for instance, for children,
Right.
how long would that run?
Well, some of them are like full-day field trips that will do different aspects. Some of them are shorter, 1-hour programs that we do in classrooms. All those programs are free, and they are made to adapt to the teacher specifications and the amount of time that the kids have or that the audience has.
When you mentioned all day, do you have facilities for people to get food and drink?
Well, we don't. The nature of refuges is that they're remote areas, and that's just one of the kind of features that refuges are generally, is that they tend to be remote areas and these large plots of land set aside for wildlife habitat. We do have a headquarters that is for all 8 refuges in southeast Louisiana. That's located in Lacombe. And that has a visitor center that's open on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. It's operated by volunteers. And that area has a lot of facilities for people to have a meaningful experience.
The visitor center tells them about the refuges.
That's right.
And where they can go and how they get there, et cetera.
Yeah, the visitor center is a great stepping stone for people that might not be super familiar with all the other refuges in the area, and it kind of acts as a gateway for education and kind of giving people more information about the resources available for them to engage.
Do you have a sizable number of people who stop there?
Well, it's in Lacombe, so it's between Slidell and Mandeville on the North Shore. That in itself is making it a little bit more remote.
Yeah.
That's why it's open on Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. The property that it's on is got a great story to it. It used to be a seminary prep school, and years ago it was owned by Richard Lesh. He was the ex-governor of New Orleans, or of the state, and in the 1950s to the 1960s, it was operated as a horticulture attraction called Bayou Gardens. So it's got these beautiful manicured gardens with tons of camellias, about 400 varieties.
Oh, really?
They come in bloom in February, so we do get kind of a peak visitation in those winter months.
Okay.
A lot of camellia enthusiasts.
All
But
right.
what was once a church was retrofitted into our visitor center. So it's this huge space. And it's kind of been transformed into telling the story of the 8 refuges in southeast Louisiana.
Okay, well, now you told us about Bayou Sauvage.
Bayou Sauvage, yeah.
Tell us about another one.
Yeah, so on the North Shore, in the 1990s, Fountain Blue State Park covers a large plot of undeveloped land on the North Shore. But between I-10 and Fountain Blue State Park, a lot of that land was set aside in the 1990s for Big Branch National Wildlife Refuge. It's an interior marsh unit and forest area. Some of that land is vital habitat for an endangered species that we have locally called a red cockaded woodpecker. They live in longleaf pine trees. And that interior marsh is super valuable, not just for the North Shore that doesn't have a levee protection system around it, but for all the crabs and other fish and aquatic species that go into those freshwater units to breed and help supply Louisiana with all the great seafood that we enjoy.
Well, when you were talking about the birds, did the tremendous oil spill, and I know for a while that was a real problem having
Sure.
to do, have we recovered from that, for the bird population?
Yeah, from my understanding, I don't think the birds on their migratory journey. The areas that we have here in Southeast Louisiana, the refuges themselves, weren't incredibly affected, by some of the, by that disaster. But I think recovery is still something that is certainly defined in different ways. And as we move forward, there's a lot of opportunities for meaningful recovery projects and other kind of restoration projects that are always happening on our refuges.
Well, now these migratory birds that sometimes utilize your refuges.
Right.
What birds are these?
Yeah, so when we look at migration routes, the Mississippi River is the primary migration route, one of the major migratory routes in the whole entire world. And so I mentioned briefly about half the birds in North America fly that route from all the way up in Canada, all the way down the Mississippi. It's called the Mississippi Flyway.
And then down to what, to South America?
Yeah,
or?
some of them stop down here, in winter here, and some of them continued their journey south. But so when you're a bird and you're flying, you're looking for places to rest and to feed and to fatten up and then continue that journey. And so these big refuges and other natural areas on that flyway provide that for the animals. And one of the great spots is right here in Southeast Louisiana. We have almost 400 neotropical migrants that make their way down here annually. It's one of the most,
Really?
The great thing about the Gulf Coast and being where we are at the end of it, the Delta is one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet Earth, and that both goes for what's on the ground and what's flying above.
Well, the bird that comes to my mind is geese.
Sure.
Because they are so obvious
Right.
in numbers.
Right.
But you're saying that there are many other migratory birds that pass through and maybe even stop in our area.
Yeah, so on the little patch, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have the duck, and the blue goose is a symbol for the Fish and Wildlife Service as
Okay.
well. But mostly, ducks. When we look at ducks and their migratory routes, almost all ducks are migratory, and those ducks, end up down here, and that's one of the things that we monitor is duck populations to kind of. That's one of the major things that biologists monitor for
Are you
avian
concerned
populations.
about hunters, killing ducks and geese and I don't know what else?
Well, so the whole reason that the agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, really exists in a lot of ways is to preserve land because of massive amount of hunting that happened, in the early 1900s. When we looked at that time period and the history of why the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was established, it was to preserve, a lot of duck habitat and a lot of migratory bird habitat. One of the things that every duck hunter has to purchase annually is a duck stamp. And the duck stamp, the funds for that are used to purchase lands by the Fish and Wildlife Service, set aside specifically for conservation. So, that's one of the really unique things about the Fish and Wildlife Service is the ability for it to continue to purchase lands for the purpose of habitat restoration. A lot of that is for migratory
Other than
waterfowl.
that funding, the rest of your funding is federal government?
Yeah, so it's a federal government agency within the Department of the Interior. So like the National Park Service or the U.S. Geological Service or the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Now, among the 8 refuges,
Yes.
are they all pretty much similar, or do some of them have special aspects to them?
Yeah, each one is unique in its own right, and each one has its independent story of how it was created.
Okay, well, tell us about some of them.
Yeah, so Bayou Teche is in Franklin, Louisiana, in St. Mary's Parish. It was set aside specifically to preserve habitat for the Louisiana black bear. So that's a unique spot.
For black bear.
That's right.
And you still have a population of black bear?
Yeah, there are populations of black bear in multiple areas in Louisiana.
And if people visit that refuge, they don't get out of their car, or what?
Well, yeah, there's some hiking trails and things. One of the things that we're always vigilant about, making sure that when we tell visitors, what they're going to see, is that we don't really make any promises. I think if you tell people that you're going to go see a black bear there, 99.99% of them, will never see a black bear. And I think one of the things that we want people to do when they go visit refuges is, have an open mind. It's a great opportunity to get outside in some nature areas, but there's no guarantee with wildlife observation.
I see. Well, so black bears are one of the animals you're protecting.
Sure.
What else?
Well, so there's so the endangered species that I mentioned, that red cockaded woodpecker, that's something that is a really unique feature on Big Branch National Wildlife Refuge. So those birds, their population numbers are kind of in direct correlation with the amount of available habitat. So one of the things that the Fish and Wildlife Service does is that we manipulate the habitat for the benefit of those animals, and that includes we use prescribed fire, and we use some of these artificial cavity inserts to mimic what these birds would create themselves if they had larger population numbers. So that helps provide the actual habitat and homes that these birds utilize.
And do they need a particular source of food?
Yeah, well, so what they need is kind of it's referred to as a savanna. So inside of a longleaf pine forest where you have a grassy understory rather than a bunch of shrubs and things, they need access to the ground to forage. So the way to do that is to have a prescribed fire. So fire really will kill a bunch of the other shrubs because it will move through and burn the other shrubs, but then it'll leave new, fresh grassland, and the birds prefer that, and they need access to the ground to forage. So it's very important for them to have this ideal habitat for them to kind of live and propagate.
Okay, well that's very interesting.
So,
Tell us about one of the other refuges.
Yeah, so we also have Delta National Wildlife Refuge, which is all the way past Venice. That's 50,000 acres. It's the largest of the 8 refuges. It's really at the end of the Mississippi River, and it's one of the places where new wetlands are being created. You still have the natural sediment flow from the Mississippi, and that creates these new large areas of wetland. And because of Delta's unique location, it is really a testing ground for a whole bunch of different projects, and it's one of the most vital spots for birds and fishing and all kinds of other neat activities.
This is a part of the Delta, or the entire Delta is?
So it's part of the Delta. But the refuge itself is called Delta because of its location. So it's a large tract of land down at the end of the Mississippi.
Okay. Now, among all of these
Yeah.
refuges, and I regret that I see all over this town people just throw their trash anywhere.
Sure.
You have a problem with people trashing up the refuges?
Yeah, I think that's a problem that we have in any remote area. One of the ways that we combat that is really through volunteer stewardship. Coming up over the next few months, we have a bunch of different activities that will even be addressing some of the litter issues that we have all around the lake. On September 16th, which is right around the corner, we do a big event in coordination with the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation called Beach Sweep. And
Beach Week?
Beach Sweep.
Beach Sweep.
Yeah,
okay.
so it's an organized litter pickup all around Lake Pontchartrain. So we'll pick up thousands of pounds of debris and garbage that was thrown out of cars or dumped in these remote areas, trying to address some of those issues.
Well, it's pathetic that we have to clean up behind people, but like when I drive on I-10, which I do frequently,
Sure.
and I just see people just throw their trash out, and then we have to pay for someone to come pick it up.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, rather than having people pay, which is always something that we do, I mean, and volunteer time is certainly worth its weight, in whatever you're giving. But one of the things that we do in all of our refuges is really encourage volunteerism. We have this year we had over 515 volunteers contribute almost 15,000 hours of their time, and a lot of that is done in service of the refuge, and a lot of that time is spent, picking up litter in remote areas or doing, these habitat restoration projects.
Yes.
But in terms of time investment, one of the easiest things to do is some of those litter pickups. From when we had Hurricane Isaac come through, the we called it the rack line. It was kind of the debris line of where the water came up on shore. It left tons of debris in some of these remote areas. And over the course of a year and a half, we did a bunch of organized volunteer projects to address some of those issues and pick up a lot of that trash.
How does subsidence and erosion affect you?
Yeah, it doesn't just affect me. I mean, it affects everybody here in Southeast Louisiana and everywhere.
About the refuges.
Yeah, so the refuges themselves, we have done a lot of targeted restoration projects. This last Saturday, in coordination with the city and the 10-year anniversary of Katrina, we had 80 volunteers out planting marsh grass, and that marsh grass, acts as a great starting point to address some of the issues that we face in terms of subsidence, in terms of some of the marsh loss that have happened in some of these areas over time.
Well, we all have a subsidence problem.
That's right.
And in the city, I don't know that there's anything they can do about it. We just keep sinking. But for your refuges, you try to rebuild them?
Yeah, a lot of our projects in terms of restoration are targeted restoration projects through marsh grass planting with the help of volunteers. There are other projects down in Delta, that large refuge down at the end of the Mississippi. We've done small diversions of the Mississippi and built up some berms there, and the berms act as like a sediment diversion. So you stagger these basically like a jetty.
So your agency is doing that.
We've done that in cooperation with other organizations. One of the unique things about the Fish and Wildlife Service is that in our mission, it is working with partners. So that includes volunteers and other partner organizations that have like missions to do habitat restoration projects.
Well, I spent many, many years of my life in business in the French Quarter, and that big building there used to be called the Wildlife and Fisheries Building.
Okay.
And I presume you had a lot of offices there. Where are they now?
Yeah, well, so the headquarters for all of our refuges is in Lacombe. And so that's kind of the principal spot for all 8 refuges in Southeast Louisiana. And that's from Baton Rouge all the way down to Venice, Louisiana, and the Chandelier Island chain as well.
But I think in that building, didn't you also have some kind of a museum?
Well, one of our sister agencies, the National Park Service, has some offices still in the French Quarter on Decatur Street.
Yes.
But I'm not positive about the Fish and Wildlife Service offices being located down in the quarter.
Well, they were for quite a while. All right. Well, what else? We still have a little time that you can tell us whatever you want to about your refuge.
Well, I think one of the greatest things and what I would encourage kind of the public, especially if they aren't familiar with what the refuges are or what's going on at the refuges, is I would like to encourage them and invite them to come out to Wild Things, which is our annual open house. It's October 17th this year, and we have over 50 partner organizations, and it's celebrating National Wildlife Refuge Week. So it's a good opportunity for people to come out, get engaged, and learn about what the refuges offer and all the things that we have here in Southeast Louisiana.
Where does that take place?
It's going to be at the headquarters in Lacombe, at the property that I had mentioned earlier.
Okay.
It's October 17th. It runs from 10 to 4. It's all free.
Do you generally get a good turnout?
We do. We've had, this last year was a banner year. We had 5,500 people come out for the event.
Oh, really? What,
Yep.
you have it in an auditorium?
Yeah,
or
it's
what?
outside. So we have a bunch of tents set up for exhibitors, and we also have a large wildlife youth art contest that's inside one of our larger buildings.
Okay.
And the visitor center that I mentioned earlier is kind of on display as well.
And there will be adequate public notice about this event in advance.
Yeah, so one of the main reasons I'm here now is to promote that event and all the other great things that people can do on the refuges.
You have to continue to do that because people's memory are quite short. Now, how do you respond if someone says, well, if you see one refuge, you've seen them all?
Yeah, well, that's one thing that is absolutely not true because although each refuge has its own kind of features, whether some of them have neat public access points like raised boardwalks that can get you out into marshes or swamps that you would not be able to get to on your own. We can't walk across water, so if you have a boardwalk that goes across some of these marshy units, it really gets you in remote areas that you wouldn't see otherwise. The other really unique thing about the refuges is that they change every season. If you go in the fall, it's very different than if you go in the middle of summer or even in the winter.
I see. So repeat trips are still interesting.
Absolutely.
At different times of the year.
Yeah, because both the way the different animals that are using that area changes, and although we live in a fairly warm climate all year, the small changes in temperature are very drastically different, and the way that those refuges look is entirely different in different times of the year.
Well, when you talk about animals, what comes to my mind is alligators,
Sure,
snakes.
Yep.
What other kind of animals are we talking about?
Yeah.
Nutria?
Well, yeah. So nutria is an invasive species, so that's something that we battle all over in the area. But it's not just the animals; it's also the plants.
Of course.
And that's something that is super important. So in Bayou Sauvage, for example, when Katrina and the levees broke here, it flooded the refuges, which were freshwater units, with salt water. That salinity killed a lot of the native hardwood trees as the salt content seeped into the soil. And now as we've approached the 10-year anniversary of that storm, a lot of that salt water has been flushed out. And we're really reaching a really excellent point to address some of those issues through targeted restoration projects of some of the native hardwood forests there. And those maritime forests, these native hardwood forests that run from here out all the way across the lake, that path on the ridge on Chef Highway and across I-10, that was a natural land bridge that was full of these native hardwood forests and this maritime forest that's super vital for neotropical migrants and other migratory waterfowl.
But the salt water will kill them?
Yeah, it really decimated a lot of that forest. And so now, as we've approached that 10-year anniversary, a lot of the salinity in the soils has been flushed out, and we're in the process of doing some great restoration project on that ridge now.
All right. So you're optimistic about the future, and you've got great plans, and you want to encourage people to come out and enjoy what's there.
Yeah, I mean, these are American public lands, and they're set aside for wildlife, and it's different than a park. Parks are set aside for people and recreation, but we want people to have a broader appreciation for the importance of these public lands because they belong to the American people, and they were set aside specifically for wildlife conservation, and we want people to engage in those in meaningful ways.
David, I hate to say this, but our time has run out.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And I want to thank all you folks for watching our show. We hope we will see you often, and look for us on the various spots on the internet where our show is given.